Hello, and welcome to the recording on planning for instruction, bundling indicators for English 1 through 4. Before we get started, we're going to jump into a little bit of housekeeping, starting with some introductions. So, my name is Casey Prince Harvey, and I work at the South Carolina Department of Education in the Office of Assessment and Standards. And I am here today to support you with our high school ELA standards. As we are working through today's session, I do want to let you know that there is a corresponding note catcher that also serves as your landing page. So not only will you have a note catcher where you can jot down your ideas and reflect on some of the questions throughout today's session, but there will be links to pertinent resources that you may want to reference as we are working through today's session. If you registered for the live webinar, then you will receive that note catcher along with the recording. But if you are joining us through our YouTube channel or through another format from the recording, then you will see on the screen that you have a tiny URL and a QR code, both of which will take you to a copy of the note catcher. So you'll have it either way. Finally, I do want to remind you about our high quality instructional materials and resources. So high quality instructional materials and instructional resources and supports will be shared throughout this presentation, as well as some examples that may be on your landing page. And we'll share some additional examples that we have created as well. So as a reminder, the resources that are shared in this presentation are just some of many examples. Curriculum is determined and selected at the local level, and instruction should be based on student interest and need. So in addition to what is shared today, please be sure to consult your high quality instructional materials for resources and engagements to support student learning. With that being said, we'll go ahead and move on to today's purpose, which we have split into two. In box one of your note catcher, you'll have a place to reflect on this purpose and break down some of the language. So our first portion of today's purpose is to explore the research and evidence for bundling indicators to maximize instructional planning and delivery time. The second portion of today's purpose is to provide instructional structures to support bundling indicators to then support planning for the 25-26 school year. So our hope is that you will learn through this session to identify natural connections between indicators to create meaningful bundles that enhance instruction in high school ELA classrooms. We'll explore strategies for designing lessons and units that integrate multiple indicators in ELA as well as other content areas. Additionally, you'll discover how to align these bundled indicators with your district's chosen high quality instructional materials to ensure consistency and rigor. So our hope is that this session provides insight into the importance of bundling, gives you some ideas for your planning, and affirms the work that you already do, because we know that so many of you are naturally bundling indicators in your instruction, especially at the high school level. So our time together will be broken into three parts. First, we'll explore the idea of bundling indicators. Then we'll talk through and plan some instructional structures to support that bundling. Finally, we'll have some clarity and closure. So let's get started. I'm not sure if you've seen this, but recently there's been some discussion across the internet and social media about how people visualize the months of the year. This has sparked some heated debate as different people envision the calendar year in different ways. So I want you to think about how you envision or visualize the months of the year. What do you see in your head when you think about the months of the year? On the screen, I'm going to just show a few examples of different ways people have interpreted that information or tried to write it out to help people understand how they visualize. So sometimes you see things in a circle where certain months of the year fit into certain parts of that circle. Sometimes some months look a little bit longer on that circle than others. The example in the bottom left hand side of the screen does not look like it was made by a teacher, because we know that those summer months can feel a little bit short when you're on summer break. But the one in the top right might look a little bit familiar for teachers because December can sometimes be a little bit long. Um, so there's not a right or wrong way. It's just sparked some interesting debate. Now, keeping that in mind, how do you visualize the ELA standards for your level? Do you maybe see them as a timeline where pieces are introduced incrementally? Maybe they're a checklist in which indicators are covered by a lesson and then checked off in a linear fashion. How do you see that in your head? How do you see those standards in your head? While there are definitely benefits to pacing the standards to ensure coverage, what other implications might there be to thinking of the standards in only this way? Well, one consideration is that providing instruction on the ELA standards in a linear or checklist format can oftentimes eliminate the opportunity for intentional bundling of standards to help students make meaning of the skills and content within ELA. So while each indicator might need its intentional explicit instruction, there is also evidence that supports the intentional bundling of indicators to reinforce and practice those expectations and support students to achieving mastery. As we're thinking about that, in our sessions, we always want to point back to what the ELA standards document says in order to ground our work. So the ELA standards document does actually say something about bundling indicators. Let's take a look at this quote from page 20 of our standards document, which is the explanation of strands. I'll give you just a moment to read the passage on the screen. The explanation of strands makes it clear that the intent of the ELA standards is not to teach them in isolation, but to group and intentionally teach indicators based on need and relevance. In other words, not all indicators will always require a separate lesson, activity, or resource. Purposeful planning on the part of the teacher can yield effective and efficient results, and that's what we're going to explore today. So, what do we mean by bundling? When we say bundling indicators, what exactly does that mean? Well, we do have a description here on the screen. And you see there is box 2 of your note catcher, which will serve as a place for you to jot down your thinking as we explore the next few slides, building or solidifying our knowledge. So, our description of bundling indicators is the intentional pairing or connecting of indicators across standards, strands, and or disciplines during an instructional experience, lesson, or unit. And I want you to think, what does intentional mean? How can we ensure that we're being intentional in how we are bundling those indicators together? We see here that bundling indicators can happen across standards and strands, and it can happen across disciplines. So we'll talk about each of those during today's session. One additional thing to keep in mind is that bundling indicators or expectations does not always mean that we're teaching each expectation to mastery. So it does not always bypass instruction. Just like on the other end, we may not always need one specific targeted lesson for every single indicator. We also don't want to just pay lip service to an indicator by saying that we've bundled it in a lesson. So there is a balance. So let's talk about some of the different ways that you can bundle indicators. We know that you can bundle indicators, especially in ELA, in multiple ways depending on the context and content of your instruction. Some of these things are already taking place naturally within the ELA classroom, and we will explore some examples of those today. So the first being to bundle indicators within an ELA strand. So one thing that we might consider here, one example might be AOR 4.1 and AOR 5.3. So these are both AOR strand indicators. The first one is looking at perspective and purpose in an informational text. And then the second is looking at argument and rhetoric in an informational text. So within a unit or within a lesson, these two may pair together really nicely. So that may be happening naturally. Additionally, it can also be natural to pair indicators across two different ELA strands. For example, we still have AOR 5.3, which again is argument and rhetoric in informational text, paired with C 1.1, which is argumentative writing. So in this case, we have a reading indicator paired with a writing indicator, but both are addressing argument in some way, shape, or form. So they would pair together really naturally. Additionally, you can also bundle ELA with another discipline. So perhaps you have an oral communication indicator that's going to pair nicely with a social studies indicator, where students might create presentations on a historical event or person. Or, like the example on the screen, we're taking that argument and rhetoric indicator for AOR 5.3, and we're pairing it with a media arts indicator from our visual and performing arts standards. We've actually explored this idea of bundling and working across disciplines in a previously recorded webinar on interdisciplinary research and writing, but we are going to further explore that idea in today's session as well. At the high school level, bundling with other disciplines adds additional complexity to instruction, and it helps students to see the ways in which content and skills intersect and connect. And that's particularly important at the high school level as students are preparing for that post K-12 world. So I want us to pause here briefly, and I want you to consider what the purpose of bundling indicators is. Why might it be important to bundle those indicators within a strand, across a strand, or across disciplines in intentional ways? Well, our findings for this would be that bundling indicators is going to serve different purposes depending on the grade band and level of instruction. So our purpose for bundling at the elementary level might look a little bit different from our purpose for bundling at the high school level. And we're going to see this most clearly through our vertical progression. So I want us to take, for example, the vertical progression for AOR 5.2, which is on the slide here. And this is our standard for informational text features and structures. So take a good look at that vertical progression, particularly towards the bottom at the K5 indicators. So in K5, new skills and content are frequently introduced. We can see this through the use of the bolded words that are at each grade level. So when we see bolded words in the vertical progression, that lets us know that that is the first time students will be seeing that language within that particular standard. So there's quite a bit of bolding K5. So we know there's not a lot of new learning. So because of that, it drives the need for the explicit instruction around that new learning through targeted instruction and lessons. As a result, bundling becomes the opportunity to reinforce and practice that new learning. But then, as students move into the middle and high school grades, what we see is that skills and content are less frequently introduced, but they increase in cognitive complexity. So there's not as much bolding. But when we look at the verbs for those skills that students are demonstrating, they are beginning to analyze, they're evaluating, they're critiquing, and with certain standards, they're looking both within and across texts. So as a result, bundling serves as an opportunity to refine those skills, deepen cognitive complexity, and provide real-world applications and connections through that disciplinary integration. So depending on what grade levels or grade bands you're looking at, bundling is going to serve a different purpose because of the way that students are learning or what they're learning. Now, we've talked about bundling within a strand, across strands or across disciplines, but there are also specific formats for bundling, which would be the how do we bundle. So there are multiple ways that we can bundle, but today we're going to discuss 3, which may already be natural parts of your instruction. So these bundling opportunities can happen again within and across disciplines. So first might be through a theme. So we may bundle through a theme that allows students to see how the concepts they're learning apply to their everyday lives. Sometimes we see these in our high quality instructional materials, and we might build in additional opportunities or activities that connect within ELA and across ELA and other content areas. We may also bundle through a project, which involves the investigation of a topic, but it differs from traditional thematic units because they might be more fully integrated. We may also bundle through real-world connections, and this gives students real reasons to interact with text, to write, to communicate. And so each of these is going to have its own specific reason or sort of an end result of what that might look like. And we are going to explore each of these today. But just keep in mind, we may bundle through a theme, we may bundle through a project, or we may bundle through real world situations or problems. But like I said previously, bundling indicators does not bypass explicit instruction. So we're going to look at examples of student experience with bundling indicators and ways that students may demonstrate their understanding. Just keep in mind that there is a time and a place for both that and explicit instruction. So we're going to look at that through this table, where we look at explicit instruction versus our experiences for demonstrating that understanding. So when we think about explicit instruction, that is a direct explanation or step-by-step instruction of skills or concepts. It provides structure and guidance, it ensures objectives are met, and it addresses a variety of learning needs. And so we would provide the explicit instruction when we're introducing new concepts or providing targeted support. So if a student is seeing an indicator for the very first time, or a new skill within that indicator, that might be an opportunity for the explicit instruction around that indicator before we move on to those experiences for demonstrating understanding through a bundling opportunity. So those experiences would be the specific tasks, activities, or projects that students engage in to practice and develop their skills. The purpose is to provide opportunities for students to apply their learning, experiment with content and style, and receive feedback. So this is where students would demonstrate the learning of the skills taught during the explicit instruction. So again, if we are introducing a new concept or skill, there may be a time and place for that explicit instruction before, during, or after that bundling is taking place, so we ensure students have fully mastered the concepts. So again, it's that balance between the bundling and the explicit instruction. And while we bundle indicators within our ELA standards and even across disciplines, it's also important to keep our overarching expectations at the forefront of our planning. So we have 6 overarching expectations in our 2024 ELA standards, which you see on the screen here. And many of these skills and expectations have the potential to transfer across content areas. So we'll come back to that throughout the rest of today's session, where we look at examples of bundling and how we might intentionally build in connections to those overarching expectations. So what is our why for this? Well, bundling, especially when bundling across disciplines, can help build background knowledge and help students make meaning of the content and skills within ELA. As we know, background knowledge is particularly important when it comes to reading comprehension. So this is not only relevant for students at the elementary level, but also at the secondary level, when the text that students interact with continue to rise in complexity. And this is not only the case for novels and short stories, but think about those textbooks in other disciplines and even manuals for industry certifications that students may be interacting with at the high school level. We know that as students are moving towards the end of their high school career, they're often working towards industry certifications and credentials, which means that they're going to be interacting with some pretty complex text. So bundling there provides, again, support for the background knowledge, which plays a very important role in the reading comprehension. So we'll close out this section with a pause and ponder. So again, you have that spot in box 2 of your note catcher. You might want to jot this down here. What is the one piece of information from this section that you would take back to your school or district and share? Okay. We're going to go ahead and move on to instructional practices in collaboration, where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of those bundling formats and examples that we previously discussed in our overview section. So, starting with themes, as high school English teachers, thematic planning almost comes as second nature. Um, we often plan our novel studies and units based on themes, which include overarching essential questions. And from there, we bundle our indicators in a way that supports the content and the context of our unit. In addition, our instructional materials are often formatted into instructional units as well, as we can see from the examples on the screen. So I've pulled a couple of images from a few different instructional materials for high school from some of our adoptions here in South Carolina, and you can see that these units often have an essential question and sort of an overarching theme. For example, Unit 2 in the example on the left being survival, and then the example on the right, the theme of that entire unit will be against all odds. And underneath that, those goals are going to be the ways in which those indicators and those skills are bundled together throughout that unit. In addition to the units that are within our high quality instructional materials, teachers also often create their own thematic units. So on the screen here, we see an example of bundling within a thematic unit. And I want you to note that this example bundles across disciplines as well as within one strand of ELA. So throughout these examples, I'm going to show you bundles that have a disciplinary connection or crossover. You'll see examples that are bundled within one strand of ELA or bundles that take place across strands. So in this example, our theme would be the hero's journey. We have our indicator for English 1 that addresses theme, paired with our English 1 indicator that addresses literary text structure, connected to our disciplinary bundle of human geography that talks about cultural patterns and processes. We've then pulled in an overarching expectation for ELA, which is overarching expectation 1. Now you see here, I've not given you a text, but if you've ever taught English 1 or you've seen this theme before, you probably are already thinking about what texts might pair to bundle these skills together in a really intentional way. In addition to that, I want you to reflect on any examples of thematic bundling you have created or used in your classroom. So as you've built out units or as you've built out lessons that are focused on one specific theme, what examples have you created in the past? Are there ones that you come back to over and over again? Are there some that you've thought about but maybe haven't tried yet? So think about what some of those might be. So we've talked about theme. Now we're going to talk about bundling through a project. And in this case, I want you to explore and review some examples that are on your note catcher in box 3 and reflect on those before we talk about the examples. So go to box 3 of your note catcher. You'll see there are a couple of examples that are linked on that note catcher. Take a look at them, reflect on how the example, whichever you chose, supports bundling within and across disciplines, and then we will talk about those examples. So I'll give you just a minute to do that. Okay. So the examples that are on your note catcher are actually examples from my own classroom. So I pulled a few examples, um, one being the character profiles, which would be something that would take place bundled within ELA. So an ELA indicator paired with an ELA indicator. Um, and in that case, we have an outline of a body representing a character or multiple characters from a piece of reading where the different parts of the body represent different aspects of the character's personality, their motivations, their fears, the changes that they go through throughout the story, and then those would be supported through evidence from the text. The other project example would be the Alternative Portrait Project, which bundles together ELA and visual arts. So this is a very specific case because it is using one particular text, um, and it challenged students to create an alternative portrait of themselves. Um, Based on how they feel society views them. So they create the portrait, create the artist statement, and then from there you can see the example on the screen of my students actually putting those alternative portraits into a gallery activity or a gallery event where we invited the visual arts classes to come and visit and hear their statements and see the alternative portraits and give feedback. So again, what we see here are two examples, one that bundles within ELA, one that bundles within ELA and across another discipline, each of which is going to be a different sort of length and a different sort of complexity, but both would be considered projects. So I want you to pause and ponder here, completing one of the following sentences. I could use, I could adapt, or I could share. Based on everything that we've seen so far, including the examples of the projects or even the units, the thematic units that we explored in the previous slides, is there something here you could use, that you could adapt to meet your needs, or that you could share with someone else? All right, moving into real world situations. So, bundling through real world situations opens up multiple opportunities for that bundling within ELA and then across those disciplines. So, here is another example from my class where students created an interactive biology museum in order to teach their audience about specific aspects of biology. So, this was English 2 paired with biology because the students were taking biology at the same time they were taking English 2. So the students conducted research on those biology standards. They navigated informational text. They created their own projects and their own end products, which included the building of their interactive exhibits. So you can see here the picture of the students actually building out their product. And then on the right would be their final product, which we took to Adventure, which is the children's museum, for a family day. So students could actually, and really small children could interact with the exhibits while learning about science. So this would be the photosynthesis exhibit that the students created. So here is an example of what a bundle for that interactive biology museum might look like. So I want you to note that this example is specific to the student product that was on the last slide. So the biology learning expectation would vary then based on the student product. So not every student made an exhibit about photosynthesis. They might have made something about mitosis and meiosis, for example, or parts of a cell. It really just depended on the student product. But you see here, our real world situation is the Interactive Biology Museum. We have one of our research indicators paired with our communication indicator for informative and expository writing. So we've paired across ELA strands, and we paired it with that biology standard and our overarching expectation too. So this real world example or real world situation is one that was kind of a big undertaking. This was something that took quite some time to bundle. But real world situations don't always have to include a large scale end product like that biology museum. So in fact, these applications can be folded into text from your high quality instructional materials to ensure the content and um, skills really are mastered and that it enhances what's already been addressed. So, for example, I have here the letter to Viceroy Lord Irwin, which is commonly taught and is included in a lot of your high quality instructional materials. So here we see that there are ELA standards connections um, that we could pair AOR 4.1 about Gandhi's use of rhetoric to achieve his purpose and advance his perspective. 8.1 with how Gandhi uses words with positive connotations to advance his arguments. And 5.3, how his argument and use of rhetoric compared to others that they've studied throughout this unit. So all of that is really already, in many ways, embedded within that text. There are already questions and prompts throughout that text that help us to meet the intent of those indicators. But as an additional enhancement with real-world applications, students could write a letter to a person, company, or a cause that they feel strongly about using similar rhetorical strategies as this model text. So we can take something that already is there within your materials and build in that real world application through some additional bundling. So here is an example of bundled indicators that can be included in that letter writing to enhance the learning experience. So our real world situation would be letter writing for cause. We would build in our research indicator on conducting short and more sustained research, our argumentative writing indicator. We have our overarching expectation 2, and we have a modern world history indicator on the motives for and effects of European countries in the age of imperialism. So as a next step, this would help provide that additional background knowledge so that students can make meaning of the text and really understand the purpose of Gandhi's letter and what was sort of going on to cause that. For an additional enhancement, students could explore further relevant readings that offer opposing viewpoints on Britain's rule of India. So there was an Indian member of parliament who gave a speech to parliament in which he in part defends British colonialism of India. So a differing or alternative viewpoint through another text could be an additional enhancement to that bundle. So as we think about that in those real world situations, which have those natural connections to a lot of our other content areas, I want you to consider how you might reach out to content areas outside of ELA to address a real world problem or situation. And if that is something that you're interested in further exploring, I do highly recommend that you take a look at our webinar recording on interdisciplinary research and writing. So that takes us to our big activity or our big engagement for this session. So on your Notecatcher and landing page in box 4, you'll see that you have some examples of bundles or partial bundles for English 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what I would like you to do is select and review one of those provided bundle indicator planning documents, which is going to look very similar to the examples that you've seen previously. As you do that, I want you to discuss and reflect on a theme, project, or problem for students based on those indicators. And you'll see that the overarching expectation piece is incomplete, so you'll want to add in that overarching expectation. From there, develop a description of your instructional plan for your bundling experience. So if you think that those indicators might be bundled really well through a project, what might that project look like? What might you do? If there is a real world problem that might be addressed through that particular bundle, What would that look like? Or is there a unit with a theme that's already in your instructional materials, for example, or a part of a novel study that you already do that you could then fold in that bundle through a lesson or through an engagement? Finally, you'll want to add your description to box 4 of your note catcher. Again, keep in mind that the examples that are on your note catcher are just that. They're examples. They're not exemplars. It's just an opportunity to start practicing how to plan with bundled indicators. Additionally, you will see that some of the examples are ELA only, or they're ELA with another content area. Sometimes they are ELA across strands. Sometimes it's ELA within a strand, just so you can see the variety of bundles that you could potentially create. So as you are working through that, hopefully it's getting your gears turning. There are some next steps. So first, I want you to consider how you can employ the idea of bundling indicators in the next few weeks or months. At the time of this recording, we are closing out the school year, which means that you may be thinking about what next school year will look like. And what summer planning may look like. So maybe you already have a few ideas and things that you're rock tumbling in your head that now that we've talked about some of those bundling formats and those bundling scenarios, you have a clearer picture of how you might make those connections. Box 5 of your note catcher is a place where you can jot down those ideas, record your plans as you begin thinking about that intentional planning for instruction through the bundled indicators. That then takes us to our clarity and closure, and we will wrap up today with a mirror, microscope, and binoculars reflection. So box 6 of your note catcher, you have 3 prompts there. You can choose which one you want to respond to, or you could respond to all 3. For mirror, it is what misconceptions have been clarified and or new learning was experienced. If you choose microscope, it is what do you still need to take a closer look at? And then binoculars, looking ahead, how will information from today's session impact your learning? I'm going to revisit our purpose, which was to explore the research and evidence for bundling indicators to maximize instructional planning and delivery time, and to provide instructional structures to support bundling indicators to support planning for the 25-26 school year. We hope that we did meet today's purpose, but as you were thinking about that, I want you to think about how we met today's purpose, what specifically took place to help us reach that goal. Again, this was Bundling Indicators for English 1 through 4. My name is Casey Prince Harvey, and I've included my email here on the screen. If you ever have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And if there is ever anything that my team can do to support you, we are just one email away. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.